So as you've heard, this legislation requires that school districts offer education and awareness opportunities around Holocaust and genocide. So what are we talking about? What do we mean by these terms, Holocaust and genocide? And I'm going to give you a couple of different definitions here, one for Holocaust and one for genocide, and we're going to use that as an opportunity to begin to surface some of the key and critical debates within the field of Holocaust and genocide studies. So the Thomas J. Dodd Research Center, as some of you, how many have been here before? You know this place? All right, good. So many of you have been here before. Good. Who's Tom Dodd? Who knows? Okay, Senator? Nuremberg trials, right. Okay, so he was a senator from the state of Connecticut from 1952 to 1971. His son, Chris Dodd, you may also know, was a senator as well until a little while ago. But Tom Dodd, prior to his service as senator, served as executive trial counsel to the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. And this was the trial that prosecuted the leadership of Nazi Germany for their crimes committed during the Second World War. So we were established in 1995 with a mission to advance a culture of human rights across the state of Connecticut. And our work is really grounded in this history, in this academic study, but also its impact in the wider community of the lessons learned during that Second World War period. And genocide and Holocaust are intimately wound within them. So we'll start with Holocaust, defining the Holocaust here. This is a definition from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. How many of you have been to the museum? All right, good. Quite a few. So about parity with the Dodd Center, so that's good, about the same visitor rates. The museum is obviously the center of Holocaust commemoration, memorialization, and education within the United States. They are enjoying their 25th anniversary. They were established in 1993, so now's a good time as any to get down there. And their mission really reflects the multiple dimensions of the understanding the Holocaust, right? So they're a memorial museum. It's in their name. So they're at once a memorial to the victims of the Holocaust, but also a museum with a public outreach and engagement mission. They also have a very robust research program studying in depth the events and circumstances surrounding the Holocaust. They have a strong educational outreach program beyond the museum. So as Steve indicated, when we stand up that website from the state, many of the materials and resources will be drawn from the museum's resources. But then they also have an important advocacy and prevention role. They work very hard in the contemporary scene combating genocide, but also bigotry and anti-Semitism more generally. So this is their definition, and I'll give you a second to read that. Hopefully most of you can see it, even those of you not in the first 4 rows. Unique features of the Holocaust, and that notion of systematic, bureaucratic, and state-sponsored persecution right at the beginning is an important marker to think about the Holocaust as not simply a manifestation of interpersonal animosity, right? I think there is often a tendency to think about this as linked to simply, well, we see a lot of this, that Holocaust education or genocide education gets rolled up into anti-bullying, right? That it's really a way of getting at anti-bullying and getting at simply this kind of interpersonal dynamic where I'm not going to be mean to you and I'm going to be nonviolent. And while there are elements of that that are important, and we can talk a little bit about how it might fit in there, it is absolutely 100% not the case that when you're simply studying interpersonal conflict, that you're getting to the heart of what occurred during the Holocaust, that there is something systematic, right, and fundamentally embedded within a larger social and political context that's really important to capture here. When the Holocaust, of course, occurred in the context of the Second World War, the most destructive conflict in human history. Millions upon millions of people died worldwide, were targeted and victimized for a wide range of reasons. But the Holocaust, when we use the term Holocaust, we're specifically designating the crime committed against the 6 million Jews murdered in Europe. In the era of the Holocaust, right, which is why we say the era of the Holocaust, but not the Holocaust proper, we can talk about other groups targeted, and other groups targeted specifically by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. So it's an important element. Again, if you're not distinguishing, if you're not applying the term Holocaust to the specific crime perpetrated against European Jews, then you're not really talking about the Holocaust as a term. What else are people noticing? Yeah. Ah, okay, good. Yeah, right. So Nazi regime, right? Obviously, they're front and center. The primary perpetrators of this crime were those in power in Germany from 1933 onward, right? Members of the Nazi Party. And other Nazi Party members who are not government officials but distributed throughout society. They're the primary. But they are not the only perpetrators. Uncovering the history of the Holocaust is uncovering a complex web, right, of activated social relationships across the entire field of European civilization during this period. And so collaborators, whether they were formally part of the Nazi Party or Germans, are also considered perpetrators to the extent that they enabled and advanced this crime. Now, we've seen in recent days or in recent weeks some controversy surface about this in Europe today. It continues to be a point of contention. There is a new law in Poland that forbids the dissemination of claims of culpability on the part of the Polish state. So these are live, contentious, difficult, challenging, and important questions to be asking. But you need to ask them if you're engaging the Holocaust in any significant way. Anything else folks are noticing? Yeah.
For me, always, the number 6 million has always stood out to me. Large number that isn't really putting that into context of if you were to count second by second up to 6 million the amount of time, okay?
Yeah.
And I think for our kids that's important to really emphasize that, well, I mean, given a certain age, but,
yeah.
but understanding that number of 6 million.
Yeah. You know, the scope and the scale of the Holocaust are unprecedented in many respects. And the number, 6 million, is an important number, and there's a kind of large backstory to where and how this number gets distilled, which we're not going to go into at the moment. But it is important to recognize exactly that magnitude of the crime. And the number 6 million sometimes can help, but it can also get in the way. And we'll talk a little bit about strategies coming forward. The number is important. But if you're not introducing your students to individual stories, connecting them to lived experiences, narrating them in a way that is accessible, 6 million is not a comprehensible number for most of us, right? We have to do tricks with seconds, right? In terms of like that's, 18 years or something like this, right? So you've got to, it's very difficult to wrap your mind around that. But Holocaust studies requires us to pull this kind of trick, where at once we keep in mind that scope and that scale and that magnitude, but then we're also able to deliver down into the individual experiences of everyday people. So this is very important as well. Including this notion, insisting on this notion that at the core of the motivation for the crime of the Holocaust was a kind of racial logic, was a virulent form of racism that has not disappeared by any stretch of the imagination, right, but continues to bubble up in a variety of contexts, is also really essential here. The ideological underpinnings of the Holocaust are an essential, and again, they remain points of contention and study and difficulty and challenge to come to a clear and secure understanding of. Nevertheless, it is absolutely the case that in studying the Holocaust, you must take apart the Nazi ideology of racial superiority and dominance and its core anti-Semitic features if you're to treat it appropriately with your students. And this is a challenge because this is a kind of thinking that in some ways is completely obnoxious to us, and we want to say, this is something none of us could ever believe, right? How could anybody subscribe to views like this? But at the same time, they're woven into the fabric of the contemporary world in very insidious and difficult ways. And so oftentimes when you're confronting these questions of ideas and ideology, you're confronting things in yourself and in your students that are difficult to acknowledge. And this racial strand of thinking is chief among them. And it's not from nowhere that these ideas came. And they didn't just fade into the background with the guilty verdicts at Nuremberg. So that ideological component, unpacking and teasing that out, is a kind of ongoing obsession for Holocaust scholars. Anything else that folks are noting about this? Right, so this is an important reference point, this literal definition here, to be thinking about. But it's also important to see within definitions, particularly definitions of deep and powerful terms like the Holocaust and genocide, not simply an open and shut dictionary definition, but the key to further inquiry, further discussion, and further elaboration. I'll also note just quickly this question of periodization is often a question out, right? When does the Holocaust begin and when does it end? And there is some debate among scholars. Obviously, there is a kind of longue durée history to uncover about where some of these ideas, where some of these techniques, where some of these strategies, where some of the politics came from. But in terms of periodization, scholars often think of kind of three different versions of what you might imagine. And a lot of it has to do with something that we didn't note but might be, is the word persecution and the word murder, right? Persecution and murder as two different things, right? So if we emphasize the persecution, the targeting of Jews and others based on this ideology of racial inferiority, then we can really begin at the beginning of the Nazi rule, right? So 1933, right? When they begin to pass laws, when they begin to constrict civil liberties and civil rights of certain groups. When it begins, though, to tip beyond the types of persecution, it's important to remember that many of those initial laws are modeled on laws we had in the United States around racial segregation. Right? So persecution is kind of the order of the day in many laws, in many societies around the world. Right? As it begins to slide, though, from persecution to murder, the other date would then be 1938. Right? So the establishment of the Nuremberg laws, the establishment of the first concentration camps, and the process of denationalizing Jewish citizens of Germany of their standing before the law. Right, so that's when it goes beyond simple persecution into a zone in which what you're looking to do is completely eliminate. And maybe it's deportation at the time or exile. And then finally, the last date would be the beginning of the the war in the Soviet Union, right? So in June of 1941. This begins the process of murder, right, in which the final solution as a term doesn't come until the Wannsee Conference a year later, but the operation to destroy by means of murder begins with Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, the activations of the Einsatzgruppen, who within a series of weeks after the invasion of the Soviet Union had murdered 80% of the Jewish population of Lithuania, for instance. Right? And so that would be another date where you could date the beginning of the Holocaust. So all of these are reasonable dates to think about as when you want to periodize the Holocaust, but each of them gets at different aspects of this definition. Any questions or thoughts? So one of the obviously important features of this law is that it says you're required to do not only education about the Holocaust, but education about genocide. The Holocaust is a genocide. In many ways, it is the genocide. But what would it mean to add that "and genocide" clause to it? I think probably most of you do Holocaust education in some ways. And if I asked you to raise your hands if your classroom, school, or district does Holocaust education, how many of you would raise it? All right. If I asked you if you did genocide, fewer, but not sure. Okay. All right. So this is maybe where we start some new territory and some new thinking. So I'm putting up another definition here for you to read. Okay. So this is from the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. It was opened for signature in 1948. Its drafting history is incredibly fascinating, but not to be gone into right at the moment. But you can see by the timing of when it was adopted that there is a clear relationship between what happened during the Second World War and the development of this convention, from which we take the legal definition of genocide. Because it's important to note that genocide is both a kind of conceptual term, like the Holocaust, but it's also a legal term. It is a crime, an international crime, that has a very specific definition and a set of consequences and procedures for prosecuting. Reactions, or what are we noticing about this definition? Yeah?
It's kind of in terms of like the news today. I find that at least certain situations, particularly one in Myanmar, presently, they say acts of genocide, but it seems like they skirt around saying it is genocide, it's just acts of. Is there any discussion over that?
Right. Well, they are using their terms carefully to comply with the legal definition, right? So what you get prosecuted for is committing acts of genocide. So when you hear this phrase, acts of genocide, what you're hearing is someone beginning to make the case that there's somebody who's committed an act that falls under the rubric of this law, right? For all intents and purposes, as a kind of non-legal understanding, that is to my mind, that's the same thing as saying that a genocide is happening. In many ways, when we say a genocide, when we characterize something as a genocide, right, the Armenian genocide, right, the Rwandan genocide, that's a kind of retrospective, historical kind of attempt to put a kind of, all right, we're going to do what we did with the Holocaust, we're going to set a period, we're going to define all these features, and it becomes a way of bounding it as an object of study. Right? When we're in the midst of something happening, and we're talking about crime, we're talking about acts committed by particular people in particular ways. And so what we want to focus on, who did what, when, where, to who, so that we can lock them up. Other things people are noticing about this definition? Yeah?
The difficulty sometimes is when you start talking to people about casualties of war versus acts of genocide.
Ah, yes.
Winners, it's casualties of war.
Sometimes, yes. And again, this is an important kind of moment to begin to drill down more deeply into what genocide is, as opposed to what the popular understanding of genocide might be. Because I think in the popular imagination, genocide tends to be equated with death and destruction, right, on a large scale. And so genocide, you know, lots of people dying or lots of buildings burned, what is that? That's genocide. Looking closely at this document, you'll see that that's actually not the definition of genocide. More broadly within the context of international law, genocide is one of a series of what we call atrocity crimes. Right? These are the most serious crimes within international law. And within that rubric are not only genocide, but crimes against humanity, gross war crimes, and crimes against peace. And to the extent that it's not independently codified yet, but ethnic cleansing usually falls under crimes against humanity. Right? So these are specific, like, legal definitions, and so you want to, if you were a lawyer, you'd be very particular about that. But underneath that are a kind of set of principles about the way war is conducted. Most of these happen in the context of war. They don't have to. This document in particular says they don't have to. And war is a tricky thing to piece out, you know, to take apart with students, because it's lots of killing, which generally we think of as a bad thing. But within war, there are legal ways of killing and illegal ways of killing. And then there are illegal ways of killing that are atrocity crimes, above and beyond standard war crimes. So this may or may not be something you drill down deeply with students in, but in terms of our conceptual imagination, we have to make sure we're understanding that genocide is something very specific. And what that specific thing is here is not just killing members of a group. Right? When we see in this list of acts here, we see that murder, this first one, is only one of 5. And then we go down the list: causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring the physical destruction, imposing measures to prevent births of the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. These last two don't look like anything's happening at all. There are no armies in the street for that. There are no bodies. There's no kind of visible sign that they're happening. So why would they be on here? The crime of genocide isn't the death of individuals. It's the death of a people, a group as such. Right? Killing people is only a way of getting at the group, the most heinous, the most total, the most brutal, and the most irredeemable way of doing it. But it's only one way. Erasing groups. The crime of genocide is, at the end of the day, not about individuals. It's about groups. And so when this legislation requires you to teach genocide and Holocaust, it requires you to think about teaching the Holocaust in its entirety, in all those dimensions. But it also requires you then to approach it and other historical features from this framework of thinking about the destruction of groups as such. To raise that question to the forefront, not necessarily all the blood and death and destruction, although that often accompanies this, but to think about what it means to erase groups, to try and erase groups. That's a taller order. And in this way, genocide becomes not just a specific crime that you can prosecute or a label to apply to certain events that you can then study, the Rwandan genocide, the Armenian genocide, but it becomes a lens for looking at the past, all elements of the past, to ask a certain set of questions about which groups are being erased and which groups are being advanced, about whose stories are being told and whose stories are not being told. So genocide can be a method as much as an object of study. I saw a hand back there. Yeah.
So it seems to me that this would suggest that you can try to get rid of groups, just not in these 5 ways.
According to the yes, according to the UN Convention, that's correct. And I want to say the UN Convention, again, is the legal definitions. Scholars have a broader range of definitions that they draw from to understand genocide and to unpack that. And within that, they go beyond these specific acts to enumerating a wider variety of things that you can do. And so the man who invented the term genocide, I should say his name, it's very important, Raphael Lemkin. He invented the term in 1944. In a book he wrote about analyzing Nazi policy in occupied Europe. And he coined the term because while he had been trying to get this principle into the public view for the better part of 20 years, no one was biting. So he needed a snappier word. And so he invented the term genocide. Right? And for him, the definition didn't have to do with these acts. He had a full range of things that people did, targeting intellectual leaders, destroying churches, synagogues, and other cultural icons, closing schools, forbidding the teaching of language. All of these things in Raphael Lemkin's mind were part of genocide, and so should be seen as such when considered with this motivation of intending to destroy a group. So yes, so if you do other things to destroy a group that are not on this list, you're probably not going to be prosecuted. But in your classrooms, we certainly can study them and ask that question. Is this part of a genocidal campaign? Other questions? Yeah.
What's difficult too is, our own textbooks will not address genocide when it comes to the United States. You want to look at Native Americans. I mean, that's the perfect definition of what happened. So it's easiest for us to look at genocide if the Nazis did it, Rwanda, other countries, other cultures. But politically, it's difficult to talk about classes. When you start saying things about the United States government, it's up here.
It does. It does. So, yeah. So we're going to go into some of these difficulties and when we get to this challenge of teaching it today. But you're right, right? I mean, this makes the lens also a mirror, and that can be uncomfortable. Okay. Other questions? Shall we move? Okay.